Hey, very good Sunday morning to my friends from Brumley Baptist Church. It is August, if you believe that, here in 2021, the very first day of August, and we are continuing our series. We've jumped from the book of Job into the book of Ecclesiastes, and this is our second week in Ecclesiastes, and it's probably the most famous passage in the book, the most well-known passage. It's the third chapter. What time is it? And this is that famous passage that, of course, goes through and where Solomon lays out and basically says, there's an occasion for everything. There's a time to be born, time to die, time to laugh, time to weep. And he goes through this, and it's a very melancholy chapter. It is a very sad chapter in some ways, because of there's many positives, but there's also the realization in this chapter that life is going to have a lot of negative things in it. Admittedly, I've never preached on this passage to this point in my preaching years, my ministry. And one of the reasons for that is one of my earliest, very distinct memories is my Granny Griggs passing away. She was the first person in my life that I remember knowing well that died. And this was the passage that was preached at her funeral. And I don't know why, but it just absolutely stuck in my brain when that happened. And so I've always read this with a little bit of a remembrance of that, and I guess with a little tear in my eye, so to speak. And I've never preached on it because of that, but I'm very familiar with it, and I go to it and read it often. Maybe part of the reason it stuck so much is because every time someone I've loved since that point has passed away, I've gone back to this passage and read it again. And even though it is melancholy and difficult, it is comforting also because of how he kind of ends up the passage and how Solomon, quite frankly, ends up the entire book of Ecclesiastes. It does have a sad tinge to it, but it comes back around, so to speak. This passage also reminds us of the most precious element that we have, and that is the element of time. You know, if you lose all your money, you can go get a new job, you can work, you can get your money back. If you lose your friends, you can make new friends. Now, I don't mean to say if you lose your family, you can get more family, but you can deepen other relationships. You can replace some of those to some extent. People are obviously precious as well. There is nothing anyone on planet Earth can do to give themselves more time. Time is what it is. It is ruthless. It gives us all exactly the same amount every day. And at the end of life, when people have wanted and pleaded and even begged at times for more time, just a few more days, just a few more hours, time is unforgiving. When it ends, no matter what we say or what we do. Now, the other part of that, to do a more positive spin, I suppose, on it, is time is a beautiful thing. Getting to have time with the people that we love, with the people we care about, nothing is better than that. Nothing is more precious than knowing and loving those people that are around us. So use it wisely, I guess maybe would be the end. But let's see what Solomon has to say about the element of time through this passage. He starts with the phrase time and place. There's an occasion for everything and a time for every activity under heaven. Time to give birth, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones, a time to gather stones, a time to embrace, a time to shun embracing, a time to search, a time to count as lost, a time to keep, a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to be silent, a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace. This follows a pattern that Solomon is pretty famous for in the book of Proverbs. The Proverbs are difficult to interpret sometimes because you can find one proverb that says, hey, there's wisdom in a multitude of counselors. And then you can find another one just a chapter or two over, sometimes even in the same chapter, that says, hey, maybe you should do this on your own. Don't be listening to a lot of different voices. Well, that's the same thing here. Notice what he says, like, for example, in verse 3. a time to tear down and a time to build. Well, how do you know which time is which? And the answer is it depends on the circumstances. In poetic form here, Solomon lists a series of opposites, pointing out that both ends of the spectrum are appointed by God. Beginnings and ends are all brought together by the same sovereign God. God who starts things is also God who finishes things. A time to kill, for example, maybe God allowing nations to go to war to one another, and a time to heal would be a time to bring those nations back together and maybe unite them for some purposes. All of these things are within God's purview of his sovereignty. God is sovereign and knows what he is doing, and therefore he always does what is right. The sooner we kind of come to grips with that, I think the better we understand life. No, it's not going to go like we want it to. Even though we're God's children and he loves us, he's not going to do things like we want it to always happen. And that's just the truth. Now, we don't like that and it hurts and we don't understand it more times than not, but it's still the truth of what is. God's will and God's timing many times will not match ours. God's wisdom and God's understanding many times will not match ours. That's just the way it goes. That's just the way it is. And there's really nothing we can do to change that or to make that different, except that we can learn to trust the one who starts and finishes everything. Knowing that God has a time for us to weep, but he also has a time for us to laugh. Knowing that God has a time for us to keep and a time for us to let go. Knowing God has a time for love and a time for those things that we hate. We just have to trust him. I've used this illustration at Brumley many times, but Corrie ten Boom famously said that when a train goes into a tunnel and it's dark, you don't jump off. You trust the engineer knows where he's going. Well, that's what we've got to do with this as well. When our life goes dark, when there are difficult times and moments, we have to trust that God still knows what he's doing because he does. Second movement that Solomon mentions in this passage is to enjoy life. It says, what does the worker gain from his struggles? I've seen the task that God has given people to keep them occupied. He's made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts, but man cannot discover the work God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and enjoy the good life. It is also the gift of God whenever anyone eats, drinks, and enjoys all his efforts. Dear friends, I will tell you, there is so much in this passage, in these few verses. Number one, we have to realize that these things on earth are temporary, and as hard as we work at any of them, they're not going to last. But also noting in verse 11 that God has made everything appropriate in its time. There's a chorus we used to sing called In His Time, and it says he makes all things beautiful in his time. And what a true statement that is. Many times it doesn't look beautiful, it doesn't look pretty from where we sit, but in the right time, given enough time, in light of eternity, things will make sense. Things will be beautiful again. Verse 11 also tells us that he has put eternity in our hearts. We long for something that this world can never provide. We have a deep yearning and need for something that this world simply can't give. We cannot be satisfied with anything this temporal world has to give us because we are not temporal. We are eternal beings. From the time God created us, we will always exist. I don't mean we're eternal in both directions. We are eternal going forward. We are immortal, maybe is a better word to describe that. So we're not going to be satisfied by mortal temporary things. Augustine said it best. Our hearts are restless, he said, until they find their rest in you, in God. God, the eternal creator. That is the only place that we find any satisfaction in. Why? Because eternity is in our hearts, even though, as he goes on to say in verse 11, we don't fully understand it. So since we don't understand it, all we can do is enjoy the life God has given us right now, which is what verse 12 and 13 says, and be reminded that every moment is a gift from our God. What a beautiful passage in Ecclesiastes 3. Lastly, Solomon says that God works. Verses 14 and 15 says, I know that all God does will last forever. There is no adding to it or taking from it. God works so that people will be in awe of him. Whatever is has already been, whatever will be already is. God repeats what has passed. This is the ultimate truth of this passage, that it is God who does all these things. Whatever God does lasts forever, and we don't add to it, we don't take from it. We simply rejoice that we can be a part of it. People will be in awe of God. May we never lose that wonder when we see our God. Don't let our circumstances embitter us or make us angry, but let our circumstances remind us of the God who is, who was, and who ever will be, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Omega, the Alpha, the end, the beginning, the everything that there is. Let us be remembering that God who always will be, using God's given time wisely. We see the right things in our life in the right times. There is a gift given to all of us by God, and that is time, the time that he has blessed us with. And we should be comforted to know that God is always at work. Even as I finish this lesson, my heart breaks a little, remembering every time I've read this passage before, and then my heart also jumps a little bit, knowing that eye hasn't seen and ear hasn't heard, nor has it entered into the mind of man what God has prepared for those who love him. And that in its time, all things will be appropriate. Brumley, have a good and godly day, and go serve your King.